Yes. So like Mauro said, we're going to work now in groups, in 4 groups. And let us think about conflict, okay? Because when we go to volunteer, we go to some of these areas that have, that have experienced one form of conflict. So I would like us now to think about conflict. What is this conflict? Maybe group 1 will think about the relationship between conflict and migration. Migration has become a very hot topic, in the world now, so much so that people from Africa, Middle East, most of these conflict areas are running away from their homes, migrating to some of these problems and, in very large groups, and it is causing a problem. So think about conflict and migration. For group 2, I would like you to think about conflict and the environment. There's a lot going on about the environment. The environment, for example, we think of natural resources, we think of oil spillage, for example, we think about climate change, among other things, gas emissions, among other things. Then group 3, let's think about conflict and gender, because when we go to the field in terms of volunteering, we engage with different groups in terms of gender, so men, women, boys, girls, among others. Let's think about the relationship between conflict and gender. Then for group 4, we will narrow it down now between conflict and ethno-religious identities. There's a lot going on in terms of ethnicity, religion, and religious identities. So let us just engage, using our own experience or the little knowledge that we have. Building on this now, we work, I think, for about 15 minutes, I think, Mauro, if I'm correct. Then we come back, quickly present, discuss for 5 minutes, and then I'll take you through some of the key issues in conflict, in terms of the conflicts that, conflict literature. And yeah, then we'll take it up from there. Do we understand? Are we happy? It's a democracy, so feel free to say.
Since that we say in Italy, the silence is agreement.
Okay.
So if it is clear, we just repeat the instructions. Now we're going to create 4 random groups. Each group will be appointed to a topic. So group number 1, it is conflict and migration. Group number 2 is conflict and environment. Group 3 is conflict and gender. And group 4 is conflict and ethno-religious identity. Okay, so just keep track of this. And there will be a facilitator, moderator in each group. So we will be present also in your discussion, but just to listen or to make questions or to keep track, okay? And you will have 15 minutes, and then we will come back to plenary and we will share the group result. So maybe also think about appointing a speaker or somebody who will wrap up, but just the wrap up phase will be quick, just 1 minute for each group, okay? So now Julia can...
Yeah, I will. Okay. I'm about to create groups. So if you're ready, you will get invitation to join the groups right now.
Yazin will be here very quickly to join the first group.
We are realizing it's necessary. Okay, I think we have to.
We're back now together.
We're back in plan.
So
our group was just concluding.
Yeah, okay. So which group is willing to go first? We have 5 minutes just, to discuss so quickly.
Will I share from our group about migrants?
Yes.
So we talked quite a bit about the situation with migrants, you know, like the transition through the Balkan countries, you know, through Greece, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the difficulties there that, you know, very often the migrants didn't want to stay there and they weren't wanted by the authorities and the local people. And there was a lot of tension, you know, like with the migrants there, and politicians as well, you know, are people blaming the migrants on criminality and things like that. So it's been a very challenging situation for those countries. And, you know, a lot of us are aware of it from the media, you know, like, and, you know, the situation between Greece and Turkey and, you know, at the Croatian border as well. And it was also sort of mentioned then, you know, like when migrants then do make it, say, to Western European countries or to the UK, very often it's also very difficult to integrate them. Like, you know, Zanab, you've probably more experience than me, but the experience I have in the UK is that if people do make it, they're either put into detention centres or they're accommodated by the authorities. And it's very difficult for the migrants then to engage in, you know, like things in society, you know, find work or even to do voluntary work, because, you know, in our organization, we'd be open to migrants or asylum seekers volunteering, but because they can't get a criminal record check, it's not possible for us to engage them because we work with children and vulnerable adults. What, you know, like what was mentioned, that's, you know, there have been sort of some cases where unaccompanied minors have been supported either through being adopted by families and, you know, integrating into mainstream education and going to college. So there's been some success there, but very often, you know, whether it's the Balkan countries or whether it's Western Europe, you know, maybe some countries are more open to welcoming migrants. There's difficulties for the migrants to, you know, integrate into the local societies. I think that was the main messages we came up with in our group.
Thank you, Vincent. Next group.
Do you want me to go, Milena or Matthias? Okay, I'll go. This is on the environment, and we saw that changes in the environment can be a cause of conflict. For example, desertification, which makes pastoralists move their herds into areas with settled agriculture, and there is then conflict between peoples. There is also environmental degradation as a result of conflict, of the use of chemical weapons, of the use of destruction of crops and imposition of famine to starve a people with whom one is in conflict. There was also the point that individual countries often look to their economy and to developments in mining and in forestry to cause pollution and to affect the environment in that way, and in ways that natural resources are not managed in a sustainable manner. It was agreed that there can only be a global solution to these matters, and that individual countries will not be able by themselves to solve these problems.
Thank you, Paul. So we've heard about migration, we've heard about the environment. We're still waiting to hear about ethno-religious identities and gender.
I can say a couple of words about conflict and ethno-religious identities. We really didn't reach any conclusion. We kind of gave a bit of picture of example we know. So Elisaveta gave us a good picture actually of the situation in the Balkans, and with some example related to Serbian and Albanians in Kosovo, for instance. So example of a city called Knin between Serbia and Croatia. In the 90s, indeed, there was a conflict that was like maybe ethno-religious in a nutshell, like at least here in Europe. And from my side, I try to give an example with Syria and Lebanon. I lived for quite some time and worked in Lebanon. Lebanon is a country that has been affected by civil war for 15 years. That was a religious political conflict. And nowadays there are Syrian refugees running away from Syria because of the conflict, which is a conflict that is definitely political, but is also ethno conflict, I believe. So it's kind of layer over another layer, and yeah, of issues that very difficult to solve actually. Considering the fact also, just to add, that Lebanon was occupied for 30 years by the Syrian army, so the political level as well. Yeah, I don't know. Overall, that we spoke about.
Thank you, Simon.
Claudia, want to add anything?
Okay. Do you want to add anything, Claudia?
I think it's enough. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the last group on gender.
I will speak. So we were speaking about conflict and gender. So we started with talking about being kind of very specific on the impacts of conflict on particular genders. The main one that is very clear is that of the effects on gender of women, weaponizing of certain forms of abuse and violence against women. Usually some women and children are some of the first victims, and they're usually the ones who suffer the most in long term. This is also part of the overarching sense of the element of within certain conflicts. Conflict escalates to, conflict is usually a result of an escalation of men perpetuating their own senses of power or the sense of loss of power. So to retain control, they bring about a system of extreme violence. So as a result of this, there's the how this may affect different genders is from young men. Young men will be forced into becoming members of militias or joining armies and so on. But then the women will be subject to having to be their carers. They will be weaponized, violence against them will be weaponized also against the members of their family, against children. Also, the women would be expected, and usually are better, being peacekeepers. Following conflict, they're usually the people who are the main driving forces of bringing about peaceful change. This is a result of many different things, but this is part of the overall kind of scenario when it comes to gender and conflict. We would say this specifically in conflict zones, in situations of armed conflict, because to talk about conflict and gender generally is a very, very big subject, especially when we branch it out then to more speaking specifically in LGBT and people who suffer under regimes during conflict zones or in conflict areas. These are always some of the first targets that they must follow under certain rules. This is ultimately what I'd say. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Do you have anything else?
No. You've said it all. We had an interesting discussion. So thank you very much. So building on the discussions we have, in terms of conflict to do with gender, environment, ethno-religious identities, among others, migration, let us now explore what some of the scholars, the authorities, as I call them, have said. And I would like to say that just so that you will find that the slides are quite wordy, I decided to do my best, to break it down, to include as much text as I can, just so that you will understand what I'm saying, to avoid, rather than just present the heavy academic jargon, I had to break it down so that what I'm saying is legible. So, okay. Can you see my slide now?
No.
Okay, so what am I doing? I can't find it, slide 3. No, not this one. Okay, I think Maro, you have to help me because it disappeared from my own.
Yes, I will try now to open mine and to share my screen.
Okay, I found, no, it's not here. 1, 2. No, it's not here. Please share yours.
Yes, I'm just opening it.
Okay, I found it. I found it.
Okay,
yes.
In case I have it as a backup, so please.
Okay,
start.
thank you. Sorry.
Yes, you can see it.
Okay. So we're now going to talk about conflict. What is this conflict that when we talk about conflict, what are we talking about? Let us explore what some of these, authorities in the study of conflict have talked about. There are several perspectives and definitions of conflict. People like Ross look at it in the context that conflicts are presumed to be basis for solving internal variances, in addition to being, more in terms of proactive in resolving hidden disagreements, to stop them from escalating into something else. Galtung, who is one of the key authorities of the study of conflict, looked at conflict within the context of a triangle. So looking at the 3 sides of a triangle, one is constituted of goal incompatibility, attitudes, and then the other has to do with behavior. So it is like a setting where the parties in each society or in each conflict tend to have opposing interests and objectives and identifying their own sides. So in order for your own perspective to be, your own objectives to be key, sometimes people tend to engage and fight each other. Some also look at conflict as a struggle over ideals and rights to limited resources. So I'm happy we spoke about the environment. Let's think about, maybe natural resources. So oil and gas, for example, these are situations where you find, the host communities, the producing communities, they feel they are being shortchanged. They are not really benefiting from the resources that they produce. So it has to do with struggles also about power, where the main objectives of the challenges are aimed at counterbalancing and hurting, the enemy as they look at it more, so that if you destroy your enemy, you have more control over some of these. Then talking about conflicts also, Humphrey spoke about 6 different rival mechanisms when thinking about conflicts. So there's the greedy rebels mechanism, the grievance mechanism, the feasibility mechanism, the weak state mechanism, and the others. But most importantly, the grievance mechanism is really important when talking about conflicts, because people like Paul Collier spoke about the existence of major inequalities, more in terms of unequal wealth distribution, identity-based deficiencies, increasing social indignities brought about by all struggles for power allocation, and subsequently incessant poverty, which could push, communities into agitating and, over one grievance or the other against their regimes. So a lot of work has been done. I tried my best to include as many references as I can, just so that you could look up, but there's a lot when thinking about conflict. Another alternative, on the one hand, we have the grievance-based, but there are those also that that argue that focusing only on grievances, that lead to conflict is not really balanced, meaning that there's a strong emphasis on socioeconomic and political deprivations, more in terms of insufficient, needs for a provision of basic needs that arouse ethnic groups to protest against the state. A lot of work has been done by Erica Chenoweth. She's one of those that I would like you, if you have time, to read her work. And in most cases, these conflicts do not just arise out of the blue. They are embedded into deep-rooted issues. So I always argue that rather, when we come to discuss peace building, why don't we go back to the key issues, to the deep-rooted reasons why, the factors why some of these conflicts happen. So for example, if we're talking about distribution of resources as core characteristics of deep-rooted conflicts, why don't we go back and discuss the issue of resource allocation, the inequalities that exist in terms of distributions, as well as identity differences? Why should one major ethnic group be in charge of some of these resources, as we see in conflict-affected areas in places like Nigeria, for example? Why are some groups starved from benefiting from some of these resources extracted from their own environment? So deep-rooted factors are key in understanding conflicts. Without really understanding the key issues, the factors that lead to some of this conflict, you won't be able to really understand and assess the conflict that you are looking at. So when we talk about conflicts, we think about nonviolence and violence. So when we talk about nonviolence, this is a civil form of engagement, with your enemy, maybe against the state, for example. It takes place beyond the framework of, the normal engagement in a theater of conflict. You don't go and take up arms, It is all about, using civil forms of engagement. So sometimes strikes, boycotts, letter writing, among other things, to draw on the understanding of the movements of collective action. So when engaging in nonviolent resistance, collective action, you need to get the support and understanding of the group or community that you're working with, because for civil disobedience to be successful, you need to work together as a group. So here, remember, we talk about Mohandas Gandhi of India, who is one of the was a key advocate of nonviolence, where everything he said, to engage with a violent state, you don't need to take up arms. Rather, you should be disciplined and think of how strategic resources you could use, so that you could bring down the enemy and get the enemy to listen to you. The fundamental awareness here is that, like I said, you don't need violence to dispose powerful and repressive regimes. Rather, you can do it in a subtle way, and you'll be able to win their attention. So it is the application of, like I said, civilian power, using protests, like I mentioned, strikes, demonstrations. But most importantly, you don't use physical harm, which is important. So nonviolence, you don't take up arms, but expect that sometimes arms will be used against you. Some of these states will use violence against you, but it is a civilian-based method where you wage this conflict and attack them using psychological, socio-economic, and political means. Sometimes when groups engage in protests, strikes, and boycotts, these actions really do affect, the enemy. Like we always say, those of us that talk about conflict, using psychological issues, because if you're not able to get your workers or people boycott everything that you're selling, then it becomes a major problem. So thinking about some examples of use of nonviolence, I mentioned Gandhi in India. Remember the civil rights movements led by the late Martin Luther King in the US, and some of his other group team members like John Lewis. Think about Mandela in South Africa, where even though he was in jail, put in jail for, for fighting against apartheid, coming out from the jail, he decided to preach, non-violence to the Black South Africans. Initially, it was resisted, but in the end, at least they were able to fight, apartheid. And now, although there are issues in South Africa, but we wouldn't say apartheid is going on like before. There are so many other examples that you could see, maybe Georgia in 2003, Lebanon in 2005, Madagascar, Ukraine, and so on. And also, for those of you that are aware of resource conflicts of the Ogoni movement in Nigeria, the late Ken Saro-Wiwa used nonviolence because he preached to the Ogoni saying, I toured around different countries and I learned the power of using nonviolence. So to engage an enemy, although because we're small in number, let us use, civil forms of resistance. Then we spoke about nonviolence, where we don't take up arms. But so many conflicts, so many grievances, issues, transform into violence, where people take up arms. I have various definitions here by the World Health Organization, talking about intentional use of physical harm, to threaten or attack another person or a group or community that will result into major harm, injury, death, psychological harm, like we discussed in our group, those of us that were talking about, conflict and gender, just so that if you break that, your enemy using maybe rape, for example, or sexual violence, that really breaks, people, and sometimes it even affects the way you engage in the society. Talking about violent conflicts, there's also the context of doing physical harm to other people, more in terms of direct violence and structural violence. So direct violence is where you take arms and attack, or maybe use machetes, you use guns. But there's structural violence where issues such as inequalities, social alienation, repression and oppression, genocide, for example, happen. Some of these are systematic. They take place. You won't see maybe the state, for example, or a strong ethnic group taking up arms. Rather, they do it in a systematic way. You are repressed, you are oppressed, you're not allowed, you're not given a voice, you're alienated and not, marginalized, among other things. So some of these are also considered as a form of violence. Going back to Galtung, he argues that violence is developed into unequal, unjust, and unrepresentative structures historically, and should be explained as a situation in which actual realizations that humans, are below their potential realizations. So more in terms of human basic needs. As a human being, you have needs more. You have a right to life, to engagement, to drinking water, electricity, good roads, among other things, But sometimes in so many areas, conflict affected areas, you find that some of these basic human needs, people are denied. Sometimes people, in the course of fighting for some of these, basic needs, you are now targeted, misread as being, as anti-government, trying to, go against the government. So basic human needs represent whatever may be fundamental, necessary for survival, But importantly, you are asking for this for the avoidance of, harm. But sometimes these are misread and looked upon as you're trying to be disobedient, and hence, violence is used against you. And if you're denied all your basic needs, it is a form of violence on the human being. Still on Galtung, he spoke about the physical, the individual, and the international, for example. So some of these issues, it starts with the individual. Maybe some of these are used physically against you as an individual, and some of them even transform and become international issues, for example. Even when we talk about internationally, you could look at it, some of the Marxist thinkers think about, you know, the capitalist systems in the international arena, where sometimes, you know, in terms of resource manufacturing, among other things, they come to some of the developing countries and they take away, you know, raw materials, go back to their countries, make them into finished products, and still come back, you know, send them back to some of these developing countries and sell them, you know, at very exorbitant prices. So sometimes this is also considered as a form of violence on human beings. So in the absence of negotiation, or in the case of failure to provide these basic needs, violence may be viewed as a mechanism for the delegitimation of another, and could manifest within the context of physical or psychological destruction of the other. So it is also considered as a social phenomenon within the context of divergent interpretations on whether one is delivering or receiving the violence. I know in our group, we discuss gender. When we talk about, you know, violent conflict, for those that are perpetrators, maybe if you feel I am fighting, I'm taking up arms because I have been denied, you know, my basic needs. Sometimes people don't consider that as a form of violence. They believe that what they're doing is legitimate and justified. And others, maybe if those receiving, maybe in terms of structural violence, where you're denied all these basic necessities, you know, people look at it as a form of violence. So when talking about violence, it is always good to look at it within the context of the person receiving and the person delivering violence. Thank you very much. There's really a lot I have to say about violence, but because of time, I decided just to give a brief overview and then we can talk, ask questions. I have a lot of resources for you to go through, about 3 slides of resources, but happy to have a discussion whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaina. You can stop sharing your screen. Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we can just give a few minutes for some questions to wrap up, to conclude this session. We promised to you more details about conflict, and this is what we delivered. It was really, really interesting, and it matches also some contents of our group discussions. So if there are specific questions for Zainab related to this presentation or also to the group work, take the chance to ask now. So for example, I just had a reflection about just the last sentence that you said about sometimes also the very gray zone regarding the perpetrator of violence, that sometimes they don't even realize that they are doing this. I was thinking about the typical role of job provider. Nowadays, whoever provides job, it is untouchable, because there are some places that are affected by economic crisis. So if a company or a corporation comes and provides job, you cannot criticize it, even if they are destroying the environment, or even if they provide very low fee. I don't want to name, I want to give name, but we have clear in mind. And this is especially in areas just like South Italy, for example. It's a problem. It's a problem that affects also my island. And I was just thinking about this when you were saying this. And the job providers, they think that they're just the saviors. And sometimes they do not actually save, but they actually cause more problems that the issues that they claim to solve. And this was just a reflection from my side. If you have also some other reflections or cases that you can bring.
Yeah, I was thinking about, sorry, can I say one?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I was thinking about migration. And what do you think, Zainab and Yassine, which is the role of the institutions in a non-paternalistic way of integrating people, like integrating migrants, let's say, right? Because which are the difficulties, which role institutions play, and what do you think it will be best to reduce this situation. For example, I know here in Spain there are a lot of migrants from Morocco and from other countries that they settle here, they have children, and even the children are still discriminated, even if they born here and they grow up here, you know. So how we can pressure the institutions to make this more smooth, right? Because sometimes they say, no, they don't integrate themselves, but which is the, you know, which is the role they are playing. They are not making it easy.
Yasin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you very much, Zainab. And thank you, Anna, for this important question. It's actually the topic of my PhD thesis. And I would say maybe we should also start from the very, very beginning by identifying, you know, what is integration actually. Are we talking about a one-way integration or two-way integration? Because if it's a two-way integration, then the Spanish community should also, you know, adapt to the changes that, you know, the incoming refugees are making to the society. And in terms of the policies that would benefit both communities, I would say, are the ones that include both communities in decision making, particularly in planning and implementation process, and also, you know, encouragement of the both communities that, you know, to come together to share something, just to make sure that, you know, they are not threatening to each other. They can contribute in many different ways to the society in terms of economy, politics, you know, psychosocial well-being, security, safety, all these measures. So there are some good examples, there are some bad examples. And as I said, you know, the good examples are shining just because they are more inclusive, more democratic, you know, listening to the needs and expectations of the people. Otherwise, one group or the other would be feeling, you know, deprived of, you know, some certain services, available resources, and then it would lead to a kind of intergroup conflict at different levels. And you're right, you know, the discrimination, biases, prejudices are very common among the very young members of the society as well, even in primary schools. You know, it's so surprising to see, you know, how these kids are now learning about all these things. But indeed, they are learning from the society, they're learning from the family members, they're learning from the TV, you know, shows, programs, etc. So it's multidimensional. Therefore, the solutions should be multidimensional. Over to you, Zainab.
Yeah, so just quickly, what I wanted to add is, you know, in terms of migration, to even pack up, you know, not even pack up, because sometimes you flee without anything, you know, for you to take a decision to leave your own home, your comfort zone, takes a lot. But in a situation where you have no option, take a look at what is happening, what happened in Syria, for example. What is happening in, you know, the Rohingyas, for example. There's a lot going on, you know. So that painful decision, you just have to flee. It's about safety, it's about your life, you know. So I flee, I leave my country and I move to an unknown territory. Remember, there are religious and cultural issues. For example, maybe for those that are lucky to come to Europe, even adapting to the European lifestyle is very difficult, and it takes time. It's a process, you know. So integrating into societies sometimes is a problem. Language issues are there, you know. Sometimes you come to a new place, you're scared, you don't know, you know, and you hear stories that some even say it outright to you, you're not welcome, you know. So these indigenous settler issues, I know it's a lot of, you know, strain on, you know, the host communities and the countries, but the reality is, for some of these issues to be resolved, you know, the support, the help, you know, is needed to go back and address those root causes why people have to flee, why the conflicts are taking place. Because in most cases, the solutions are short term. They hardly go back to address the key issues. Take, for example, you have maybe Shell is operating in your country, and in the process of extracting, you know, the oil, your environment, there's a lot of spillages, you know, you don't, and maybe if you're a farmer, you can't farm. If you're a fisherman, you know, even the rivers are polluted. So no farming, no fishing, no food. you know, and if you talk, they say you are being, force is used against you, you know. So why not go back, address some of those issues in terms of addressing, you know, the root causes, get some of these companies to respect environmental rules and regulations. But I think, like Mauro said, some of these major big companies, even if they're operating, because they provide jobs to the local communities, sometimes you can't talk. And even if you talk, some of them even decide to pack up, you know, and go to another place where they will not be forced into respecting some of these rules. So there's a lot. We have a lot of work to do in terms of addressing conflict. And believe me, we've not gone anywhere.
Okay, may I pick up on what Zainab said, particularly where she referred to root causes, because I noticed that our discussions so far and the interesting talks we've had, we're looking at conflict mostly in terms of civil society and what you might call civilians. But does that mean that if we see armed conflict, that we should always look beyond the armed conflict at the underlying or the root causes of armed conflict, because we should find them in some kind of civil society conflict, and that is where it can be addressed?
Well, for every conflict, there are root causes, you know. They don't just have, people don't just wake up and take up arms, you know. So understanding the basics, the foundations, you know, of the conflict is really important. Without understanding that, your knowledge will be limited, especially if you come to, you know, maybe say you have an opportunity in terms of peace building, there's an opportunity for dialogue, you know, you're trying to bring the two groups to the table. Without understanding why maybe one is taking up arms against the other, you'll be constrained in terms of even the depth of discussion you're going to have with them. So these key root causes are really important across the board. And when you look at some of these multinational organizations, maybe, you know, UN and among others, they always commission, you know, researchers to go down to the grassroots level and get as much information as they can in terms of the background information, because without that, then you're really constrained. Understanding the root causes is really important. That is my own argument. That is the way I look at conflict. And so depending on whether maybe you're the receiver or the perpetrator, each side has its own story. So to have a balanced dialogue, you need to understand, mainly going back historically. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sure you're right. Thank you.
I hope I am.
Okay, and I see that Anna Maria raised hand, so you wanted to comment on something or to ask?
Yes, I wanted to ask if we may have an example of a conflict where the causes were, the roots of the cause were studied and it was work on it, and how was the result, or how long did it take? I think it would be interesting. Thank you.
Yasin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, Anna, there are so many examples actually, but one could be, you know, recent one. Maybe you have heard about the FARC-Colombia conflict. You know, a leftist organization in Colombia. They fought the government for more than 50 years, if I'm not mistaken, and then they finally could come up with a peace agreement. And then FARC established a political party to be represented in the parliament. And I think this was possible only because the government and the FARC were quite determined that they will bring peace to the society. And then they had a kind of, you know, so much traffic between the two, you know, two parties supported by international community as well. And then they came up with a list of, you know, things that each party will do to finish this conflict. And then they took their responsibilities and step by step they solved them including, for example, giving up the arms and then establishing a political party, granting a certain quota for representation, etc. There have been some problems, although this peace agreement was signed. Still there were some atrocities. Some people were killed by the government forces. Some of the civilians lost their lives during even this agreement. But I think when both parties are determined enough and they have a clear agenda that receives support from the society and also from the international community, it's very likely that they can end the conflict. So Zainab, this is the one I had in mind. Maybe you can share another context.
Okay. Mauro, do we have time?
Actually, we have a conflict here related to time. So, but please, you can just give this last contribution.
Okay,
and
quickly.
then me and Elisabetta, we were thinking of having a break after this session.
Okay, so quickly, I'll talk about the conflict in the Niger Delta. So I'm bringing in an African perspective now. Fights against violent conflict against resources. The groups in the Niger Delta are arguing there about inequalities. They believe they're marginalized. They don't have good roads. Their land is polluted, water, everything, being farmers, they can't go to the farm. So even their means of livelihoods have been taken away. So initially it started with the nonviolent, Ogoni struggle, where a lot of international attention, the Ogoni got support from the United Nations. I remember a special rapporteur was sent to go and investigate the Ogoni case, and the report he came back was similar to what the local groups are saying. So a lot of interventions, in terms of how to resolve the issues. At a certain point, for those of you that are aware of, conflicts in Africa and in Nigeria, at a certain point, the Niger Delta was a hotbed of violent conflicts, because a lot of international oil workers were kidnapped, a lot of bombings of oil pipelines, hijacks, among other things, happened. So with a lot of intervention from the international community and the Nigerian government, there was a point that the Nigerian economy was brought to a standstill, because because Nigeria relies on over 90% on the oil and gas exports, but because of the violent conflicts, it was stopped, So they decided to bring the groups together and discuss maybe an amnesty. An amnesty was proclaimed and granted to the militants. But in the process of doing that, they saw it as a strategy on the side of the Nigerian state that this was an initiative that would bring an end, to the conflict in the Niger Delta. But remember, this is a region where there are different ethnic groups. For example, we have the Ijaw, which is the 4th largest. We have the Ogoni, we have the Ishekiri. And most of these groups, are in different communities. So they believe they are all independent of each other. So the discussion in terms of the amnesty was with the Ijaw. And during the discussion, I engaged with some of those that participated in the negotiations on the Ijaw side. And I said, so you were on the table with the Nigerian government. Did you talk about the root causes, for example? And they said to me, no. And I said, why? They said, because at that time, they were just looking for short-term strategies, just to, stop the violence and get the oil flowing. I said, but you had the opportunity to talk about the key issues that if some of these, definitely not all, but at least some of them are, are addressed, go back and address them maybe in terms of good roads, hospitals, because a lot of gas flaring takes place in that place. So the rate of cancer is very high. So this is one conflict that, although there were short-term strategies, they thought, they had resolved the conflict, but the other groups, were not even consulted. And even within the Ijaw, for example, there are new crops of militants that are coming up, still engaging, taking up arms. So sometimes I look at strategies in resolving conflicts without really addressing the root causes. Maybe you have short-term issues, and maybe if the two parties agree, but you find out that because there are different ethnicities within some of the groups, especially in Africa, you find that some of this agreement is a problem. Think also about Rwanda, for example, the genocide that happened, the Tutsi and the Hutus. Yes, there is peace, now they're living side by side, with even the perpetrators and the victims. But there are deep, still there are deep issues, resentments, for example. So sometimes it's very difficult to say maybe a conflict will be addressed, brought to a full stop and life will go back as normal. Just the deep-rooted issues are always there. Let me stop for now because of time.